Delighted to have you here. We've been at this 21 years now. We're in our 22nd year. Thank you. We have had speakers here over the years who have examined Winston Churchill from virtually every angle you could imagine. And all of them have been extraordinary because Mr. Churchill had many extraordinary angles. But we have never examined him as a painter. We've never looked into his painted works. And personally, I've always been fascinated by Winston Churchill as a painter. And I'm delighted that this book has appeared that we have been waiting for 21 years. This extraordinary catalog. There was really only one other catalog previous to this, published in 1967, also the work of David Coombs, without the help of Minnie Churchill, the essential help of Minnie Churchill, which he provided for this book. And it was a very fine book, and whenever we can find it out of print, we try to have it in the store. But this wonderful volume expands on it so dramatically. And it is in large part thanks to Minnie Churchill's efforts. She is the director of Churchill Heritage, which owns the copyrights to these paintings. And she has been investigating for 6 years and assisting Mr. Coombs in locating many of the paintings. Mr. Churchill was very generous with his paintings. He was a painter as a hobbyist, a devoted hobbyist. And a lot of these pictures had to be found. And Minnie Churchill, I think, will tell you a little bit more about that. But I'm delighted to welcome her this evening, Minnie Churchill.
Thank you very much, Barry. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be with you this evening, and I would particularly like to thank Barry Singer for arranging this wonderful book launch, and all of you for coming. I would also like to thank Running Press for publishing this book, Sir Winston Churchill, His Life and His Paintings in the United States. It's lovely that Edwina Sands, Sir Winston's granddaughter, a very talented artist and sculptress, and her husband Richard Kaplan are able to be with us. Together with Simon Bird, who is here this evening, we have spent 6 years searching for Sir Winston's paintings. In this book, we have 499 in colour and 34 in black and white. They are the ones that we still have to find. We know they exist, but we can't find them. If any of you know of the whereabouts of any of these paintings, we would very much appreciate it if you could tell us so that we can update the next edition. For me, the work on this book has been a labour of love and respect. I hope that you will enjoy reading it and, like me, be fascinated at seeing another aspect of this great man's life. I'm very pleased to have this chance of talking to you about Sir Winston Churchill and his art. I knew Sir Winston only in the very last years of his amazing life. The first time I met him was in 1963, when Winston, grandson of Sir Winston, invited me to lunch with him and his grandfather at 28 Hyde Park Gate, which was the London home of Sir Winston and Lady Churchill. I was rather nervous because I didn't know much about politics and wondered what we would talk about. However, I needn't have been. We had a wonderful time with my Winston talking to his grandfather about a flight he had recently made round Africa in a single-engine aeroplane. Sir Winston then proceeded to tell us about his travels in Africa as a young man, and in particular he talked about his experiences in the Boer War. Just before the end of lunch, Sir Winston rang the bell for the butler and asked him to bring the cream jug, and he poured the cream directly onto the dining room table, and Jock, his lovely ginger cat, jumped on his lap and onto the table and lapped up the cream. I thought how special it was that he cared so much about his cat. I hate to think what Lady Churchill would have thought. That summer, Winston took me down to Chartwell. The house was empty, and we had a wonderful time exploring the garden with its beautiful view across the Weald of Kent. And we then went into the house. I couldn't believe what I saw in the dining room. There were, neatly stacked on the floor, row upon row of canvases, hundreds of paintings. I knelt down to have a closer look at these paintings. There were magnificent landscapes, seascapes, still lives, as well as the occasional portrait. I knew that Sir Winston painted, but I had no idea that he was so prolific. I also had no idea that some 30 years later I would be running Churchill Heritage, which owns the copyright of his paintings. My involvement with Churchill Heritage has taught me so much about Sir Winston and his paintings. I have really enjoyed researching this for the book. Painting became a very important part of Sir Winston's life. Lady Soames, Sir Winston's youngest daughter, wrote, "Painting was a hobby which opened up for Churchill a complete new world of colour, light and shade, proportion and perspective. It was a compelling occupation that played a real part in renewing the source of the springs of the great inner strength that was his, enabling him to confront storms and ride out depressions, and to rise above the rough passages of his political life." Winston Churchill first started painting in 1915. It was after Gallipoli and the disastrous Dardanelles campaign, when he lost his government job as First Lord of the Admiralty. He thought that his career was finished. That summer, Winston and Clementine rented a small house called Hoe Farm near Godalming in Surrey. They would weekend there with their 3 children, Diana, Sarah and Randolph. One weekend, his sister-in-law Goonie was staying, and Winston discovered her painting in watercolours in the garden. He watched for a few minutes and then borrowed her brush and tried his hand at painting. He was immediately hooked. Very soon he was experimenting with oils, buying all the equipment that he needed, an easel, a mahogany palette, brushes, paints, and turpentine. The next step he found more difficult, and as he described in his wonderful little book, Painting as a Pastime, "I started with the sky. It was on that occasion blue," and later he described how, very gingerly, I mixed a little blue paint on the palette with a very small brush, and then with infinite precaution made a mark about as big as a bean upon the affronted snow-white shield. It was a challenge, a deliberate challenge, but so subdued, so halting, indeed so cataleptic, that it deserved no response. At that moment, the loud approaching sound of a motor car was heard in the drive. From this chariot there stepped swiftly and lightly none other than the gifted wife of Sir John Lavery. "Painting? But what are you hesitating about? Let me have a brush, the big one." Splash into the turpentine, wallop into the blue and the white, frantic flourish on the palette, clean no longer, and then several large fierce strokes and slashes of blue on the absolute cowering canvas. Anyone could see that it could not hit back. No evil fate avenged the jaunty violence. The canvas grinned in helplessness before me. The spell was broken. The sickly inhibitions rolled away. I seized the largest brush and fell upon my victim with berserk fury. I have never felt any awe of a canvas since. After that, Winston spent as much time as he possibly could in Sir John Lavery's studio, painting with the Laverys, who were both talented artists. Lavery taught him how to paint landscapes, interiors, and portraits. One of his earliest paintings was of John Lavery at his easel in 1915. This he gave to Lavery, who lent it to the Royal Society of Portrait Painters for their exhibition in 1919. In his biography, John Lavery wrote, "I know few amateur wielders of the brush with a keener sense of light and colour or a surer grasp of essentials. Had he chosen painting instead of statesmanship, I believe he would have been a great master with the brush. At the end of November 1915, Winston decided to resign completely from the government. As he was also a major in the Oxfordshire Yeomanry, he decided he would like to join them in France, where they were fighting. Subsequently, he was made colonel of the 6th Battalion Royal Scots Guards, and in January 1916 they moved to a village named Plug Street on the Belgian border. This was very close to the front line. Their headquarters were at Lawrence Farm. It was here that Winston painted several pictures of the desolate scene. One of these paintings hangs at Chartwell. Returning to England on leave, Winston painted at every opportunity. He spent some weekends at Blenheim Palace, where he was born, staying with his cousin Sonny, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Writing 2 articles in the Strand magazine in 1921, Winston wrote his views about painting. These 2 articles were later published as a charming book, Painting as a Pastime. He gave some advice to those who took up painting later in life. We must not be too ambitious. We cannot aspire to masterpieces. We may content ourselves with a joyride in a paint box. These 2 articles appear in our book in full. Winston started visiting galleries and studying individual pictures, looking at styles in great detail. And as well as painting with Hazel and John Lavery, he became friendly with other painters, gaining inspiration from such fine artists as Sickert and Sir William Nicholson, who taught him some of their techniques, such as projecting photographs directly onto the canvas. Winston was full of admiration for artists such as Daubeny and Sargent, and copied examples of their work. We recently found an exact copy of a Seascape by Monet. During the Second World War, Winston only painted one picture, the sun setting over the Atlas Mountains from Marrakesh. He held a conference with President Roosevelt for 10 days in Casablanca, in Morocco, in January 1943. The President was due to fly back to the States via Lagos, then to Dakar, across to Brazil, then home to Washington. Such a dangerous and strenuous trip. Winston, at the last moment, persuaded the President to visit Marrakesh, telling him that he wished to spend 2 days with him to show him the Paris of the Sahara and to wonder at the sight of the sun setting over the Atlas Mountains. The President was persuaded. Winston supplied the picnic, and the 150-mile journey across the desert into the hills began. Life was different then, and the dangers immense. The 5-hour drive was spent in both serious and light-hearted discussion. The route was guarded by literally thousands of American troops, and when they stopped beside the road for the picnic, armoured personnel carriers, Tommy gun carrying soldiers, and GIs surrounded them, and aircraft circled above. Probably the most bizarre picnic in the history of the world. They arrived at Marrakesh, staying at the Villa Taylor. That evening, the President was carried in a chair up to the roof of the tower of the villa, where they enjoyed the splendour of the sun setting over the snow-covered Atlas Mountains. That evening, they had a fine dinner with lots of laughter and singing. Churchill sang a solo, and the President was about to, but was interrupted. The day of departure of the President dawned. Winston was still in bed when the President wanted to say farewell. Unperturbed, Winston jumped out of bed, dressed in his brilliant red dressing gown with dragons on the back and a pair of bedroom slippers, came down to say farewell to his friend. At the last moment, attired as he was, he drove to the airport with his friend, going on to the plane to settle the President and admiring the courage of this fine friend with physical disabilities. Winston then returned to the villa and painted the view across Marrakesh to the snowy Atlas Mountains, and later presented this fine and unique painting to the President. After the war, Churchill was defeated at the general election. Sarah Churchill, his daughter, in her charming and most moving of books, A Thread in the Tapestry, about her father, which if you have not read it, I highly commend to you, says that after his defeat, she never loved him more than at that time. He did not try to hide the fact of his painful surprise at his almost total rejection. There was no false bravado. But his humour never left him, and they moved from Downing Street to a suite in Claridge's until they found a London home. Field Marshal Alexander invited Churchill, accompanied by Sarah and others, to his villa, La Rosa, on Lake Como. Churchill set about painting and picnicking. His mood revitalized. Sarah reports, "I really think he is over it. It's hard to tell, but last night he said, 'Every day I stay here without news, without worry, I realize more and more that it may very well be what your mother said, a blessing in disguise. The war is over, it is won, and they have lifted the hideous aftermath from my shoulders.'" In the house, Sarah writes, there were indeed some perfectly frightful pictures, and one above all he sat and stared at every evening. It was of a stagnant, murky pool, and reflected some funereal shrubbery. 2 sombre fir trees blotted out much of the sky, which looked reminiscent of a London fog, and peering out biliously between the trees was a pale and sickly sun. The picture became a butt and focus of Alex and my father the evening they were together. After Alex had left, Papa was still sitting staring as usual at the offending picture, when suddenly turning to us he said, "We are all agreed, are we not, that this is the worst picture that has ever been painted?" We murmured assent. It takes the palm, the prize for bad pictures. You must say, it's offensive. Again we nodded our assent. In a twinkling of an eye, the picture was off the wall, was prized out of its frame, and was being carried triumphantly up to the bathroom, which was being used as a studio, to be doctored. Charles groaned. "He oughtn't to do it. He oughtn't to do it." "Oughtn't he?" I asked. "No," said Charles, "but you won't stop him," and taking up the banner of passive resistance, went off to bed. I leapt upstairs, where my father was squeezing great daubs of vivid colour. The 2 boys sat on the edge of the bath, goggled-eyed. I delivered my lecture. "You really mustn't," I said, as the first vivid red hit the gloomy canvas. My voice trailed away suddenly. Beautiful flaming azaleas appeared on the dingy shrubbery. The dingy firs were given back the new green of their youth. The pallid sun, instead of trying to break through the fog with fitful gleam, sank in a splurge of glory, and the fog, as if by magic, disappeared, and the happiest of blue skies smiled down on the whole scene, which had been caught by the hitherto stagnant, repellent pool, now a kaleidoscope of reflections. It was breathtaking, it was enchanting, it was lovely. The whole thing accomplished, and back in its frame and back on the wall inside half an hour. We sat and admired it for 2 hours, exhausted but satisfied by this act of artistic rape, as my father called it. Early next morning, one by one, we tiptoed down to have a look. What would the morning reveal? Well, do you know, it was still lovely. It glowed brazenly like a bird of paradise, and we were all broken-hearted when it was once more carried upstairs to have its face washed. It now hangs back on the wall, stagnant and gloomy as before. Churchill loved bright colours. He wrote, "I rejoice with the brilliant ones, and am genuinely sorry for the poor browns. When I get to heaven, I mean to spend a considerable portion of my first 1,000,000 years in painting. I expect orange and vermilion will be the darkest, dullest colours. There will be a whole range of wonderful new colours which will delight the celestial eye." This unknown to some side to this great man, his painting gave such enormous pleasure to him, seeing him through good times and bad times, dark days and bright days. His books and speeches are well known, his paintings less known. He painted over 500 pictures, which he referred to as his daubs. I have spent the last 6 years tracing them from collections round the world for the book. This has been an enormous pleasure for me, but now the task has been, with a few exceptions, completed. I am so pleased to have been able to place in digital format at Churchill College, Cambridge, as an addition to the great archive of his papers, his paintings. For 40 years he gained so much pleasure from his pastime that he wrote, "Happy are the painters, for they shall not be lonely. Light and colour, peace and hope will keep them company to the end, or almost to the end of the day." Thank you. We're now going to show you some of his paintings. Simon, hang on, not ready. Can we go back one? This is, no, this is, am I in the way of everybody?
We can hear you.
Oh, right, thanks. Lovely. I'm not going to tell you much about them, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit. This first one, this is Goonie, his sister-in-law, who started him off on painting, and this is at the garden at Hoe Farm. And this is probably the first picture that was ever taken of him with Lady Churchill painting at Hoe Farm. This is when he went off to the Belgian-French border to Plug Street, and that's an early picture, and there he is in his uniform with a French army helmet on. This is the farm where he lived for a while when he was at Plug Street. This was the garden. Oh, we've gone. Carry on, forget. This is at Lullenden, which is a house that he bought after the war, Lullenden House, and this was the garden there. I think it's better if I stand up, actually, isn't it? Now, he was made colonial secretary in the 20s, and he went with Lady Churchill to Egypt, and they visited the pyramids, and they went to Jerusalem, and both those paintings were done at the time. And we've got a wonderful photograph of him here riding out at the pyramids, and you can also see in the picture Lawrence of Arabia, who was a great friend of his, in the corner there, in the far corner. And I just discovered the other day, I was reading a book, and it said how Churchill fell off his camel going round the pyramids. It was rather a long drop, but anyway, he got back on again. This is the Tapestries of Lenin, and this is a lovely painting, which I'm sure Edwina knows well, and it now belongs to Prince Charles. And this is another one, lovely picture, and this is the bridge at Wilton, and this is one of my favourites. This he gave to Lloyd George, and I think it's beautiful. These last two paintings were obviously of Venice, and I think they're really lovely. This one's in the House of Commons, in the Churchill dining room there. Lady Soames has loaned it to them. This, the last painting of Venice on the Rialto Bridge, that's in the House of Commons, in the Churchill dining room, where the members eat. This is a lovely one. It's the Béguinage at Bruges. He apparently made the nuns walk up and down for about 5 hours while he painted them. And there's the photograph. And what's lovely about that painting is that many years later he gave it to his wonderful secretary, Grace Hamlin. And she had it for a long time on her wall. And then when she retired, she needed to buy a house. So she asked Lady Churchill if she could sell the painting to buy her house. And Lady Churchill was thrilled, and we subsequently discovered that the painting was sold to Arthur Murray of the School of Dancing. And What was really interesting, when we were trying to track it down, we contacted the Arthur Murray School of Dancing, and an answer came back, yes, indeed, we do have the picture. It belongs to one of his daughters now, and the daughter who contacted us was called Jane Heimlich. And anyway, she then wrote and said she was coming to England, and could we show her some pictures? And she came with her husband to Chartwell, and I took them round, and he turned out to be Dr. Henry Heimlich of the Heimlich Manoeuvre. And we had no idea till we met them that day. And so it's really interesting where the pictures have gone. That's a lovely one of him painting with his detective behind him. And this is a lovely house. It's Saint-Georges Motel, and it belonged to Madame Balzan, who had been married to the Duke of Marlborough. And there's the photograph of him painting there. He used to stay there very often. That's a lovely one of him painting in the south of France. He used to go and stay at Lord Beaverbrook's house, and this was the house next door to Lord Beaverbrook's house. And if Simon moves on and we show you the painting, what was quite funny was I had a wonderful French uncle, and he came to stay one day, and he said, "You've got a painting of my house." And that was their house, Les Rocs, which was immediately next door to Lord Beaverbrook's house. And that painting now belongs to me, and I'm very proud to own it. And I used to go there as a child. I think this is lovely, a study of boats in the south of France. And this is the view from Lord Beaverbrook's house. He had a wonderful terrace, and it's the view going down towards Cap d'Aille and Monte Carlo. That's another lovely one. This is one of my favourite photographs. I'm sure Edwina must love this one too, of him painting by a river in the south of France, and you can see his detectives behind him. Another lovely one. Do you see the school children all marching up there? It's also south of France. Now, this is an interesting one. This is the famous house on Lake Como, where he doctored the other picture. And anyway, General Alexander just came for one day to visit him while he was staying at his house, and they both painted together this same view. And about 3 months ago, my son Jack, who is very interested in art and the art world and watches what's going on, he rang me and he said, "The other picture's coming up for sale, Mummy." And he said, "Are you interested?" So I said, "Well, yes, but I don't suppose I can afford to buy it." And anyway, I was abroad at the time, and he went and he bid for it for me, and he got it for me. So now we have a copy of that one at home, and we also have the General Alexander one. And the original of that is at Chartwell, and one day, when I decide to, I shall give General Alexander's one to Chartwell so that they can hang side by side, because I think that tells the story, and it's very special. Now, Churchill loved going to Marrakesh, and this is the Koutoubia Mosque there, and he spent a long time there, and this is a wonderful one of Marrakesh, and this is the famous one, isn't it, Simon? Yeah, that's the previous one. That's the famous, that's the Roosevelt one, and that's again a lovely photograph of him painting there. There are quite a lot in the book of seascapes, and they're really very interesting. That last one that you've moved on from, you can see the reflection in the sea, and I think it's beautifully done. And I talked to Mary Soames about that one, and she loves that picture. This is the ruins of Arras Cathedral. He copied this one and from a sergeant, and it's a lovely painting. And this is the only bust that Churchill ever did, and he did it of Oscar Niemann, the great sculptor who did the most wonderful busts of him, and the Queen had commissioned him to sculpture Sir Winston, and he got rather bored of sitting, so he decided to try and do a bust of Niemann at the same time, and this is the result. And we're so lucky. This came up for sale. Oscar Niemann's daughter-in-law, who had inherited all his works, decided last year to sell some things, and this came on the market at Sotheby's in London, and it didn't sell. And young Jack again, he heard about it, and he rang them up and said, could they contact Mrs. Niemon and see if he could buy it? And she agreed, so he bought it for the last bid, above the last bid, and he now has it in his little apartment in London. And what's wonderful is, when you touch it, your fingers can go down in the holes where Sir Winston's fingers went, and he had the most beautiful hands, and it's amazing and very good. That's a lovely one of the lemon-scented magnolia, which Lady Churchill planted outside his bedroom window at Chartwell, and I think that's a lovely painting, and that's a wonderful one too. This is the studio at Chartwell, and that's his father, Lord Randolph, a portrait there which he didn't paint, and there is the Niemon bust in that corner. And if any of you are in England and get the chance to go to Chartwell, highly recommend it. It's absolutely wonderful, and it's been put back how the house was between the wars, and you can go to the studio. This is a fantastic picture. I'm very proud to own this picture, and I'm so glad you've shown it this evening, Simon, because it's of Lady Churchill launching a battleship, HMS Indomitable, and Sickert taught him how to project these photographs onto the canvas, and this is how he painted it some years later, and he just did it in blue, and I've loaned it to Chartwell because I think that's where it should be, so it's in her sitting room there. And this painting is Chartwell Under Snow, and it was put forward for a very important exhibition and competition, and nobody knew who painted it, and it got first prize. And this is a lovely view of the kitchen garden at Chartwell, and the wall. You remember that he's a bricklayer as well. He built a lot of that wall, and the little house there was the summer house he built for Mary, and the view of the Weald of Kent. And there's another one of the view from the terrace at Chartwell down to his studio. And this is a very famous picture of his, the Bottlescape. And his cousin Peregrine Churchill told us how he was given all these bottles one Christmas, so he lined them all up, and the cigar boxes, and painted them all. And it's lovely. These are the black swans that he was given by Australian government, and they're on the lake at Chartwell. Another shot of the studio. So many lovely pictures. And there we are. That's the house and the lake that he built. He made that lake. And another lovely painting of him, photograph of him painting. And that's it.